Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and thanks for ReeceSupply for putting these things on. This is really, I think, a great way to get out to customers and pass on some information, and hopefully fill a little bit of your void that everybody's kind of stuck at home with right now. This morning, my name is Dave Julo. I'm from PolyOne. I cover the Rutland and Union brands. ReeceSupply carries both Rutland and Union, so that's kind of a unique situation for them as a distributor. This morning I wanted to talk about white inks, and what I really wanted to talk about was that if you've looked through anybody's catalog or gone online just to look for white ink, or tried to decide what white ink you need to use in your shop, you probably have seen that there's so many to pick from. A lot of people use the one that they've always used, mainly because it's always worked and that's what they've used. But there's new inks, new technology, new chemistry that comes out, and you should all be aware of that. But I want to run through kind of how selecting the correct white for your shop. So really, if you're selecting a white, there's a few things that you really should look at. And that's what's the majority of the garments that you print in your shop. If you print a majority of 100% cotton, you should really look at 100% cotton white. If you break the whites down into categories, you would have, there's a cotton white, there's low bleed white, and there's polyester white. And then there's variations of each one of those. Depending on what you print in your shop, and most shops in today's world print on a variety of fabrics, and that's just for various reasons. One being the customer's demands, but the other being that, there's just a variety of fabrics out there that are available to print on. So if you break those inks down into those three categories, and then you get into what type of printing do you do? Are you a manual printer? Do you print on automatic equipment? Or do you print transfers or specialty koozies, that kind of thing? Because that's going to depend on the product that you pick as well. Actually, manually printing, you want an ink that's creamier, that's not as stiff, so you don't have to, break your wrist trying to print. So, the question's always, why are there so many whites? And I think every company that manufactures inks asks the same thing. I know when we sit in board meetings, some of the executives go, why do you have so many whites? Can't one white do it? And unfortunately, the answer is no, one white can't do it. But there probably is some repetitive issues going on with them. And a lot of it's just to do with, you got a big customer that uses a certain amount, and then you make a new one that may replace that, but you're not going to pull a product away from someone that's using it on a daily basis. So if you start with the basic chemistries, cotton obviously was designed for cotton garments. I don't want to age myself, but years ago when I first started printing, the 90% of the printing was done on cotton garments, and about the only white inks that you had on the market were cotton whites. Cotton whites have some advantages, then they have some disadvantages. Then you get into low bleed. Low bleed inks were designed for 50-50 garments. Also could be printed on 60-40 and even on 100% polyester, depending on how bad of a migrating fabric you have. And then the polyester is really designed for polyester garments. It's the most expensive. It has the chemistries in it to really stop dye migration on the really bad bleeding garments. So if you have a bad migrating polyester garment that leaches color into the ink all the time, your best solution is to go with a polyester ink. Where'd it go here? So cotton white, I mentioned that, for years there, cotton white was about the only thing that was available. But cotton white has no bleed resistant chemistry in it. It's always going to be fluffy, kind of, marshmallowy type consistency. And it's going to give you your best fiber mat. So cotton white is going to sit up on top of the garment better than any the low bleeds or polyester inks. But what if you printed it on a 50/50? Well, it has no bleed resistance, so you would see the dye migration immediately, which means that if you're printing on a red garment, it's probably going to turn pink. The same would be if you printed it on a polyester. So cotton white really, just like it says, is designed for cotton. So would you do it? No, I wouldn't even attempt to print a cotton white on a 50/50 or polyester contained garment. It's just not going to work. But once again, for cotton garments, you're going to find that it's the least expensive ink on the market for white inks. It gives you your best fiber mat down. So if you print 50% or more cotton garments in your shop, you really should be looking at a cotton white. I know that one of the drawbacks has always been that when you have multiple presses and multiple employees, the fear of someone pulling a cotton white out and printing it on a 50/50 and having the issue that you will have. So a lot of people just want to go like, well, if I'm going to have one main white in my shop, it's going to be a low bleed, so I don't run into that problem. So when you get into low bleed, why 50/50 and not cotton? As you get into bleed resistance and dye migration, there's chemistries that are added, and I call it oil because it kind of looks like oil. They're more of a liquid, and they're added to, say, a similar makeup of a cotton white, yet they add chemistry into it to help stop that migration. What it does is stop some of the gassing from the polyester fabric from coming up through the ink. And so when you start adding chemistries, number one, you're adding raw materials, so you're adding cost to it. Number two is you're adding more of an oil, so you're making the ink, even though it doesn't look like so in the bucket, you're making it a little bit more liquid or flow to where when you print it on the garment, it's going to soak in a little bit or dive down into the fabric a little bit more than a cotton white would. And so that's where you lose some of your fiber mat. So can you get a good fiber mat with a 50/50? Absolutely. Most shops, if you run in and you watch, you'll see a lot of print, flash print, print, flash, roller print, mat down. And that's all to mat the fibers down. And it's mainly because of the liquid component that's in that low bleed ink. So it's a chemistry thing. But it gives you the bleed resistance. So if you're printing on a red shirt, it's not going to turn out pink if you have a good low bleed ink that is designed for that. Now, once again, if you get into poly fabrics and you get into something that has either poor rinse ability from the standpoint of when it was manufactured, it didn't go through a really vigorous rinse cycle. And a lot of that has to do with the inks that are designed and manufactured overseas, offshore. Some of those countries, it's not the fact that they don't do a really good rinse cycle, but it's the fact that they can't release that dye into the water stream. And so it's really difficult for them to do an aggressive rinse cycle and have a bunch of dye coming out into the wastewater stream. So in that case, some of those garments that come over are kind of loaded a little bit more with dye than they would be if they went through a vigorous rinse cycle. So the 50/50s will give you bleed resistance. It's probably a universal ink, for you can print it on polyester if it's not a really bad migrating. But it also eliminates that mistake that's made by printing the cotton on a 50/50. So if you got a printer that just goes over and grabs a bucket of white ink and you know that everything you got in there's 50/50, you know that as an insurance policy, you're probably going to be safe. And that's really the reason that 50/50 is the most common inks that are used in most print shops. So would you print a low bleed on cotton? Absolutely. It'll work fine. It just won't stay in fiber mat as well, but you can make up for that by the print flash print. You can make up with that, by changing mesh counts, and there's things that you could do. And most printers have, really got on to figuring out how to make that white work for across the board on their fabrics. So then you get into polyester, and why only polyester? Well, so polyester ink is going to be on the other end of the spectrum from cotton. It's going to be the most expensive ink that's out there on the market. It's going to have the most migrating chemistry in it. So it's going to be one that's going to sink down into the garment a little bit more. It's actually designed to go down and attack the gassing as it comes up. So it's going to give you your best migration resistance, bleed resistance. But it's also going to be, the most expensive product when you buy a white ink. So to take that and print that on a cotton garment would be number one overkill, but you would be spending a lot more money on those fabrics than what you need to. It doesn't give very good fiber mat down. As a matter of fact, you would have to flash print that. And even on 50/50s, you're going to run into some, fiber issues where the fiber wants to stick up through the ink. So flash print. But you really want to kind of stick to 100% polyester, the really bad migrating fabrics, in order to, if you really want to use poly ink. The other issue with poly ink, and it's a phenomenon called ghosting. And what that is that there's some dyes that are made in 100% cotton inks, some of the dyes that they use to dye those colors. And it's usually the pastel colors, light blues, yellows, light greens, sometimes heather gray, that when you print that polyester ink and you stack those garments coming out of the dryer while they're still hot, and it has to be a combination of kind of heat, stacking the garments hot, the humidity has to be just about right. And when those things happen, you'll get what looks like the image that you printed on either the back of the other shirt, or even sometimes I've seen through the shirt into the back of the shirt. And it's really a chemistry reaction between the dye that's in the 100% cotton garment and the chemistry that's in the polyester ink. So it can also happen with low bleed inks. It's definitely more common with polyester inks, but if you got a really aggressive low bleed ink, the chemistry that's in that to stop that migration can also cause this ghosting. So that's something you really want to check. On our website, Rutland.com, there is a place, if you go and look for technical information, there's a sheet there that kind of gives you an idea of how to do a ghosting test. It also shows you how to do a migration test, and there's some nice little tips there just to help you, kind of test your garments to see when you're printing on a new garment if you're going to have any kind of issues such as that. So what if you print that on a 50/50 or a cotton shirt? You're going to spend more money than you need to. You're going to get very poor fiber mat. It'll take care of any migration issues, even on a 50-50. You'll just have those fiber issues. And, sometimes it's a insurance policy for that one garment that just, you can't get past that little pinking that happens on that. And then you want to watch for the ghosting. So how do you pick the correct one? When I mentioned cotton, low bleed, and polyester inks, one thing that I didn't really talk about in any detail was the fact that the cotton whites, every company may make one or two, maybe one that's heavy body, maybe one that's really creamy. You get into low bleed whites, and that's where you'll find a wide array of them. And if you really look at them and kind of gauge them, way to gauge them is that you're going to have some that are kind of on the low end of the pricing spectrum, and then you're going to have some that are more expensive. And it's kind of like the amount of chemistry that's in it, the way that it was put together, and what it was designed to do. Obviously, the lower cost ones were designed to be in the large automation side of the business where, every penny kind of counts towards what you're doing on your job. And are they good? Yes, they're good. Are they as good as a higher end low bleed? Depends on what you're printing on, but probably not going to give you the best bleed resistance, probably not going to give you the softest feel, and probably not going to be the easiest inks to work with. But they're going to kind of keep your costs down. On the other side, if you're printing on, $25 garments and you want to have a smoother finish or, softer hand or more of a matte finish, and you want a nice creamy ink that's easy to print with and stuff, you're probably going to be up on the higher end of the white scale. And when I say low and high end, I'm talking usually the range is somewhere between $40 and $70 between the low end and the high end. So you start with your fabric. What fabric are you printing, and what ink do you really need for that? If you print all 100% cottons, you should only be using 100% cotton. If you print 50% cotton and 50% low bleed, and you have the controls in your shop, you should use both. If you have 6 automatics and you're printing, a ton of both kind of garments, and you're worried about that one issue that somebody could grab the wrong bucket, then you probably need to find a middle of the road low bleed ink that has a creamy, kind of soft finish, so that it will kind of stay better on your shirt, give you better fiber mat, and do all the garments that you print. It's important to look at what type of setup you have with your press. You're printing manual, automatic. Like I said, if you're printing a manual press, you should look at some of the newer formulations that are creamy and fluffy and print easy, so you don't end up with, carpal tunnel syndrome and those kind of things. What's the customer expecting? Is the customer expecting a gloss finish? Matte finish? Do they like that big athletic, heavy body plastisol look, or do they want something that feels a little softer, not necessarily like water based, but something that has a softer, matter hand, more matte finish and more softer hand? So that's kind of the way, especially the fashion market, is going. How accurate is your curing? White inks are the most difficult to cure. I think tomorrow I am doing a seminar just on curing. But, white inks are going to be the most difficult to cure simply because the thick deposit that you put down on white inks. So white inks demand that they reach that temperature of 320 degrees for about a minute. And then, is your pricing set for different inks? Do you charge more for a polyester garment with a polyester ink than you do for a 50-50 garment with just a low bleed ink. You should take those things into consideration because it does cost more. It does cost more to print. It's more difficult, not necessarily difficult to print, but it's more difficult to work with. And so it does take a little bit more time to print. So you should look at your pricing. If you're printing all 100% cotton garments and you're using 100% cotton white, you could probably be at a lower cost than if you bump up and spend $20 more a gallon for your ink. So those are things you got to take into consideration when you're trying to pick the correct white. So why are there so many? We kind of went through it. We went over the reasons of why we make so many whites. One of the reasons is that when we come out with a new formula, then usually the competitor comes out with a new formula and that competitor comes out with another formula. And then everybody's chasing the other guy. And that's why in the low bleeds area, there's so many from one cost to the next because of the competition that's out there. Also, I could take an ink in and run it on somebody that's running a rock press, and it works fantastic. And then you take it across the street, and they have maybe a different press, and the same exact ink just doesn't run as well. In some cases, if it's a large customer and they have certain demands or certain things that can be met, we'll take that same ink and modify it slightly, whether it's to make it a little bit creamier to print, whether it's to make it a little bit more bleed resistance or whatever, and then take it back. And obviously you can't just call it the same name or give it the same number. So voila, another ink is born. And that's kind of why in that low bleed range, you'll see such a wide selection. Do we need all the ones we have? Probably not. But once again, if you're selling hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of a certain product, you're probably not going to pull it off the market. So the real answer is because of you guys. We make inks, for you, the printer, and we want them to work in your conditions. Your conditions are different than the guy across the street, and your equipment, your employees, what your customers demand, those are all different characteristics that you have to look at when you're going to choose an ink. So I hope I touched a little bit on, how you would go forward to kind of select a white ink. I do recommend that, you look at some of the new ones, even if you've had one that you've used for 10 years. Look at some of the newer chemistry. You'll see things that are fluffier, creamier, easier to print. Some have optical brighteners to make it look brighter. Some you can get a really bright white with less of a deposit down. Some of them are curing better. So those are things that you should discuss with your salesperson. You can find the right white at Reece Supply, I guarantee you, because once again, they carry both of our brands, and by that, they probably have a selection of over 40 different white products. So I'm sure working with your sales guy, you can figure out which one will work for you. And that's